Welcome to this edition of Real World Business Law, where we discuss real-world issues impacting businesses and executives. I'm Declan Leonard. I'm managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard, and I also head up the firm's employment law practice.
And I'm Connie Phelps, Neigel. I'm a counsel at Berenzweig Leonard, and I head up the corporate transactional and M&A practice here.
Connie, it's great to be in here with you. Tell us a little bit about what the corporate and transactional practice is here at Berenzweig Leonard.
Yes, we are a very active group, and we have a wide range of business with the firm. So for our clients, we do everything from general corporate and contractual review all the way up to buying and selling businesses on behalf of our clients.
You just finished. In fact, we're just coming out of the holidays here, and you spent part of New Year's working on a deal that closed, right?
I did, very happily.
Yes. Congratulations on that closure.
Thank you.
Sorry you missed out on some stuff. Before I forget, we're coming here to you from our studio here, BLC Digital Strategies here in Tyson's Corner. Todd Castleberry, president of BLC Digital Strategies, always makes us look good on these videos, so we appreciate that. This is your first actual time in the studio, your first podcast.
Yes, it is.
How does it feel, Connie?
A little nervous, quite frankly, but I tried to do my homework and reviewed a bunch of the podcasts that you have started in the past. And one thing I did notice differently is that in the prior podcast, you had a lot more facial hair.
I got bored over the holidays. Yes, I shaved it off. Funny thing is, so I finished shaving. Come out, my high school daughter is sitting there, and she's so sweet. She's in her teens, of course, so she loves her dad. And she looks at me and she's like, "Ooh, now I can see all of your face." I mean, it was touching. So I said, well, I guess I should stick with this. So we are talking today about the topic of earnouts, and it's actually a great topic in the M&A space. Before we get any further, though, what is an earnout?
So an earnout is typically seen in the sale of a business, for example, where the buyer and the seller may not agree on the purchase price. So part of the purchase price is allocated to this earnout. So it's a payment that's made over time, and it's dependent upon the achievement of certain goals. So it's dependent on the performance of the company.
Okay. You know, it's interesting because when I'm looking at like an M&A deal, you know, where a company is being sold, its owners sell it to a buyer. People always say, well, how much was the price? And I, to myself, always think that is a meaningless number because as you and I know, having done these deals a number of times, there's so much that goes into it. It's cash at close. Okay, there's certain escrows and everything, but then there is this earnout. So, I mean, you know, somebody doesn't sell a company most of the times when you say, well, I sold my company for $10 million. Rarely does a check at closing pass between a buyer and seller for that amount of money, right? I mean, it's usually, there's more contingent payments like earnouts.
That's right. And so typically in a deal, you have the buyer and the seller, they may not agree on the purchase price. So the earnout is a way to bridge the gap between the amount that the buyer wants to pay at closing and the amount the seller thinks that the business is worth.
Got it. So from a seller's perspective, I mean, obviously a seller always wants to get as much money at that closing table as possible. But as you're rightly pointing out, that's just not the reality. I mean, a buyer is going to also have the same concerns about putting too much money on the table at closing. So it sounds like an earnout is just a way to sort of bridge that divide and still, you know, kind of align with both sides' interests.
Exactly. And both sides should be aligned. They want the company to perform well, and they're both incentivized to have the company perform well so that the earnout can be achieved. Yeah.
So give me an example of like earnouts that we see.
So a couple of typical examples for earnouts are revenues. That is a financial metric that a seller would be more inclined to want because it's more easily measured and, at least theoretically, more easy to achieve and, frankly, less able to be manipulated by the buyer. From the buyer's perspective, the buyer would be more interested in using a metric like EBITDA because they might view that metric is more closely tied to the value of the business.
Got it. Because revenue, I mean, again, revenue can sometimes be a meaningless number. You can be $100 million company from a revenue standpoint, but if your EBITDA which is your earnings, basically sort of a profit measure that, is used in the accounting world and used in the M&A world. If your EBITDA is really narrow, then it doesn't matter what that $100 million revenue is. So that's why buyers want to look more closely at EBITDA to say, okay, this is a better measure of profitability.
Exactly. They're not as interested in looking at the low margin revenue that might be part of the calculation of revenue, but isn't really a true value metric for the business.
So you talk about the financial earnouts. Those probably are the ones we see most often, right? Whether it's tied towards revenue or profit EBITDA. But are there other aspects of earnouts that are not sort of tied directly to finances?
Sure. You might have a metric, for example, that's tied to the achievement of some other type of goal. So, for example, in the government contract space,
a lot of our clients, government contractors.
Exactly.
Yep.
A lot of our clients are government contractors. The successful winning of a particular government contract might be a metric that's used to determine whether an earnout is achieved.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that these earnouts are only creatures of contract. So it's as much as the imagination of the buyer and the seller of what they want to agree to on a piece of paper that they both sign that formulates the earnout. So I actually had an earnout one time that dealt with, so it was a government contractor that was selling their company to another government contractor. And it wasn't conditioned on getting a new contract. It was actually conditioned on extending the period of, this is what they called it, the period of performance for an existing contract. And if they extended the period of performance, the seller would get additional money, so it was very lucrative for them to do so. And what's interesting about that is we ended up getting into litigation as to what constitutes period of performance under a government contract. So that's a lesson for a later topic on this podcast, but that's just something to be wary about. Yep. Okay, so we talked about what types there are. How about like key provisions that we would want to see in an earnout?
So some of the key provisions, obviously the most important one to both parties would be the amount of the earnout. They might also want to specify a maximum earnout amount, sometimes a minimum earnout amount. The metric that's used to determine whether the earnout is achieved.
That's critical because, again, post-closing, people's memories start to fade. Oh, this is what we meant. No, this is what we meant. And, so yeah, the metric's really important.
Metric is very important, and the more specific, the better in that case. The period of the earnout, and here shorter is usually better. So you typically see a 1 to 3 year earnout period.
Okay. And when you say shorter is better, certainly from the seller's perspective, the shorter the earnout, the quicker they'll get their money in hand, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And potentially buyer might want to push that out a bit more and push the price out. So these earnouts actually they show up where they are contained is in the sale documents. I actually like using examples. So I have the earnout provision written in its legalese, as we lawyers love to do. But I like to do an example. For instance, if X, Y, and Z, and I find that when you do real life examples, it helps the business folks and it helps to avoid disputes later on. So that's just kind of maybe just a drafting tip that I have learned about. Because as you say, you want that metric to be specific and understandable as best as possible.
That's right, and I think. That's especially true if your earnout has more of a graduated effect. And it's not binary. Either you achieve the earnout or you don't. But if there's some graduated payment, then examples I think are very, very helpful.
Yeah. And so when we're talking about earnouts, and the reason why we selected this topic, we're not talking about the exception to the norm. Many, if not a majority of M&A deals have some form of a earnout, wouldn't you say, in your experience?
I think that's right, and particularly with middle market companies, obviously I think the higher the dollar amount, the more likely you are to see an earnout.
Got it. Okay. And so let's talk about that. From an advantage, we just established that we see them all the time, you and I. Why would buyers and sellers want to put these earnouts in there?
So I think it's going back to kind of the origin here when we initially started talking. It's a way to bridge the gap to come to an agreement on the purchase price. From the seller's perspective, It allows them to get a higher purchase price than what the buyer is willing to pay at closing. And it also, frankly, allows the seller to spread that payment out over
Great point,
time,
yeah.
right? And reduce taxes in any given period. From the buyer's perspective, I think it leads to more certainty. There's less risk of overpaying for a business because, yes, they're paying a certain amount at closing, but the earnout is only paid dependent upon the actual performance of the company rather than the seller's possibly optimistic view of the future of the company.
Yeah, I mean, we know it as due diligence, but like in a real deal, what happens is, a seller goes to market and says, I want to sell, and then you get a buyer that's interested, and a buyer does a letter of intent and then goes through the due diligence, sort of the lifting up of the hood and seeing what's there. But we all know that while that is very important process, that's a very important process of like buying a company, like you're never going to really know how good a company is until you get in that owner seat yourself. And so this is a way for the buyer to kind of measure a little bit of the risk and not take on so much of the risk. Because if everything the seller is saying, then fine, seller, we're happy to pay you this earnout. But if you've been if you've been engaged in evaluations that are probably more on the rosy side, well, I'm going to be protected as the buyer because I'm not going to go further out of pocket for these earnouts. How about disadvantages? Like why would a seller or a buyer or both want to avoid these?
So I think the disadvantage to the seller would be if, for whatever reason, the performance of the company is less than maybe what was anticipated by the seller. Purchase price is going to be less, right? They won't be able to achieve that full earnout. So from the buyer's perspective, one of the disadvantages might be that the relationship continues between the buyer and the seller. So the buyer, in some respects, is still accountable to the seller and has the additional administrative burden of keeping the records with respect to whatever the metrics are and ultimately, having to pay out the earnout.
Yeah, exactly. They've got a budget for that. I mean, it's not just what they put down at cash at close. They've got to now budget that. That's going to come out of their profit for operating. But you're right. There is that real aspect of it where when you sell your business, I mean, I think oftentimes the sellers want out. I mean, many times sellers stay in, for a period of maybe 3 to 5 years as part of the transition process. But I think also buyers want that kind of clean break and want to be able to put their own imprint on the company. And whenever there's a earnout, especially a revenue generated earnout, a lot of times there's reporting requirements. They've got to report financials on a quarterly basis to the seller to let them know like kind of how that process is going. And it's a bit intrusive in practice. I mean, it doesn't sound bad on paper, but it is, I've talked to clients about this, it's a bit intrusive in practice.
I agree.
So tax considerations. Neither one of us plays a tax lawyer on TV, but we've got great resources. Scott, I'm looking at you. But from a high level, like what are some of the tax pitfalls or things to watch out for with these earnouts?
So from a tax perspective, the seller, of course, would want the earnout to be considered part of the purchase price, so that it would be taxed as a capital gain.
Yeah, which is always going to be a lower tax than ordinary tax.
Exactly. The buyer, however, doesn't get the deduction for that. So, there's always tension there between the buyer and the seller with respect to taxes.
Yeah. So this is all part of the negotiation. We said earlier on that these are creatures of contract, and so they can say anything. So for instance, if you have an earnout that is clearly part of the purchase price, but just paid at a later date, upon achieving a metric, that's most likely going to be taxed as part of the original consideration for the sale at capital gains. Because when you sell a business, it's taxed at capital gains, which is usually hovering around the 20% mark for capital gains, which ordinary income, like wages and stuff like that, is much higher. So you want to make sure that you don't do something unwittingly. Now, the buyer may negotiate and say, no, we're going to make this part of your ongoing employment contract post-closing. Therefore, you might have swooped that number into ordinary income, which is taxed higher. So those are things to watch out for. You mentioned earlier also that from a seller's perspective, when you do an earnout, you don't get that check right at closing, which, and sometimes seller wants that. But that's also a hellacious tax hit for the seller in that one tax year. Whereas with an earnout, if the seller gets some of it at closing, some of it year one, some of it year two, year three, it's great tax savings for them.
Exactly.
So let's talk about disputes that come up, because we know we wouldn't have jobs if there were not disputes and between businesses, and Earnouts is no stranger to these disputes. Talk about that.
That's right. And that's why it's really important that one of those key provisions in an earnout be the dispute resolution mechanism. So you want to have some clearly spelled out guidelines for how any dispute is resolved, whether that be through mediation or arbitration. And another key thing to think about is the metric. Whatever the metric is that the parties have decided upon, they want to spell out how that metric is measured and delivered to both parties. So, for example, if it's typically a financial metric, then how are those financial statements prepared? By whom are they prepared? Put it in the agreement, just leave nothing to chance and allow the parties to negotiate it up front rather than having to do it in the midst of arbitration, mediation, or heaven forbid, litigation.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, because these are all contractual in nature, you can agree in advance that maybe the accountant comes in and is the tiebreaker and says, no, this is what I think is the revenue, or this is what the profit number is, and I'm going off of this. I'm using my generally accepted accounting standards, practices, and so you can do whatever you want. But your point is so well taken. Don't leave things to chance, and particularly try to avoid litigation. I'll tell you a quick aside before we wrap up. I mentioned earlier that a deal that I dealt with, I actually didn't deal with the deal. I dealt with the subsequent litigation. Government contractor sold to another government contractor, and part of the earnout was to extend the existing contract. It was to extend the period of performance. Well, what happened was they did extend the contract, but the way the government, as we know in the government contracting world, the way the government extended it is they gave option years. And so the buyer was saying option years is not predictable enough. Those are basically zero. I can't take those to the bank. We were saying, but that's how you extend a contract in the government contracting world, by option years. And so what happened? We didn't have one of these dispute resolution mechanisms. We ended up in litigation. That was not a pleasant, for either side, it just wasn't a pleasant process to have to go through costly litigation when that could potentially have been ironed out and worked out on the front end. So, yeah, I think that's right. I think there should be a prevailing attorney's fees provisions in there to keep both parties in check, because, if you've got a $200,000 earnout on the table, but it's going to take you $100,000 just to litigate it, that stuff, that comes into the equation.
I agree. Anything you can do to keep the parties out of the courtroom? Sorry, Declan.
Yeah. Yes.
I know that's where your bread and butter is, but from
it used to be. I'm a little bit more. I'm a little bit more of an advisor. I've got Nick and the great team here doing so much of the litigation now, so they can have it. No, just kidding.
Well, that's why I'm a deal lawyer. We like for everyone to be happy at the end of the deal.
It is true, though. When you get to the closing table and you do the actual closing event, everyone's so much happier than like when I go to court or when I'm in a deposition. People are just not as happy. So you do have the sunnier side of the law. I think fits your disposition very well. Connie, thank you for coming in the studio. Hopefully you'll come back. I don't know whether I'll have a beard or not. I'll see what my 16-year-old says. I'm scared of her, and so I'll just do whatever she says. But anyways, it was a great discussion on a good topic, and we'll keep these M&A type topics going throughout the year.
Thank you. And thank you for making my first podcast fun.
There you go. Good deal.